I want to begin with a simple idea, not a clinical one, not a diagnostic one, just a quiet observation about being human. The observation's this, that distress doesn't come from nowhere. It doesn't emerge in isolation, and it certainly doesn't belong solely to the individual. Distress is not a fault in the system, it is the system speaking. For a long time, we've been taught to locate distress inside the person. If you're anxious, something is wrong with your brain. If you're overwhelmed, something is wrong with your coping skills. If you can't function, something is wrong with your ability to adapt. And so the work becomes fixing the individual. Therapies, interventions, medications, they're all circling around the same core assumption. The problem is you. But what if the assumption is not just incomplete? What if it's actively harmful? The ecosystemic model of distress asks us to take a step back, to zoom out, to stop looking at the individual as a closed system and instead begin to see them as part of a living, shifting relational ecology. Because none of us exist in isolation. We exist in constant interaction with our bodies, our environments, our relationships, our cultures, and our systems of power. And every one of those layers shapes how distress emerges. So, rather than asking what is wrong with this person, we ask what is happening around this person, what is happening between this person and their ecosystem. In the ecosystemic model, we can think of distress as emerging across three interconnected layers, not separate, not hierarchical, but entangled. The first layer is the body mind as an environment. This is not just the body or the brain as separate things, it's the body mind as a living ecosystem in its own right. A space where physiology, sensation, emotion, and meaning are constantly interacting. Here we're talking about things like interoception, which allows us to feel our internal states, fatigue and sleep, pain and illness, hunger and thirst, hormonal rhythms, stress responses, trauma stored in our nervous systems. Now, within a medical model, these are often treated as causes of distress. But in an ecosystemic model, they're conditions within a system. They don't exist independently of the world around us. Your exhaustion is not just about your body, it's about the demands placed upon that body. Your anxiety is not just a chemical imbalance, it's a response to a perceived threat, real or anticipated. Your shutdown is not dysfunction, it's a nervous system attempting to protect itself. So, even at this most internal level, we're already dealing with something relational because the body mind is not isolated, it's responding, it's always responding. The second layer is the immediate environment. This is the space you move through every day. The rooms you sit in, the people you interact with, the sensory landscape around you. And this is where things often become very real very quickly, because environments are not neutral. They either support us or they strain us. Think of Luke Bearden's golden equation. Autism plus environment equals outcome. If you take an autistic person and put them in the wrong environment, you can't be surprised when you get a negative outcome. Think about sensory environments: noise, light, texture, unpredictability. For some people, these are background details. For neurodivergent people, they're constant cumulative sources of stress. Think about predictability. Do you know what's coming next? Or are you constantly having to adapt and guess and brace yourself? Every unknown demand increases cognitive load. Every sudden change pulls energy from the system. And think about the relationships you have with the people in your immediate environment. Are you met with understanding, or are you met with correction, judgment, and control? Do you experience co-regulation, or are you expected to self-regulate in isolation? And then there is dignity. Are you treated as someone with autonomy, or are you someone to be managed? Because distress doesn't just come from sensory overload or cognitive demand. It comes from being denied our personhood. So at this level, distress is not an internal failure. It's often the perfectly coherent outcome of being in environments that do not fit us. And then we move on to the third layer, systems and structures. This is the widest lens, the one that is most often ignored. These are the forces that shape everything else. Healthcare systems, education systems, social care, economic structures, cultural norms, policy decisions. These systems determine who gets support, who gets believed, who gets excluded, and who gets pathologized. They decide whether environments are accessible or hostile. They decide whether difference is accommodated or punished. They decide whether distress is met with care or coercion. And crucially, they decide whether we understand distress as a human response or as an individual defect. So when we see high rates of mental health difficulties in autistic people, for example, the question is not, what is it about autistic people that makes them vulnerable? The question is, what is it about the environments and wider ecosystem they're placed in that produces this level of distress? Because when distress is patterned across a population, we're not looking at individual pathology, we're looking at systemic failure. Now, here is where the ecosystemic model becomes both powerful and uncomfortable, because it removes the illusion of simplicity. There is no single cause, there is no single solution, there is no quick fix. Instead, what we have is a dynamic system where each layer influences the others. A person becomes exhausted. That exhaustion reduces their capacity to manage sensory input. The environment becomes overwhelming. Relationships become strained. Support is withdrawn. Systems fail to respond. Distress escalates. And at each stage, the system responds, not by changing the environment or the ecosystem, but by trying to change the person. And this is how we move from acute distress to chronic distress, to burnout, to crisis. And in many cases, what we begin to see is something we might describe as acquired neurodivergence. This is the idea that certain forms of distress, chronic anxiety, trauma responses, dissociation, even psychosis, they're not simply disorders that emerge spontaneously. They're adaptations to prolonged ecosystemic strain. They're the system reorganizing itself in response to unsustainable conditions. So rather than asking, how do we treat this condition, we might ask, what conditions made this state necessary? Because if the environment does not change, the distress will return, or it will transform into something else. And this is why individual level interventions on their own are rarely enough. You cannot therapy someone out of an inaccessible world. You cannot medicate someone into belonging. You can support, you can stabilize, you can create moments of relief. But if the ecosystem remains hostile, the system will continue to produce distress. So what does this mean in practice? It means we stop asking people to adapt endlessly to environments that are not designed for them. It means we begin to design environments that reduce the need for adaptation. It means we prioritize predictability, sensory accessibility, relational safety, autonomy, dignity. It means we build systems that respond to need rather than punish it. And perhaps most importantly, it means we shift how we understand distress. not as something to be eliminated, but as something to be listened to. Because distress is information. It tells us something is misaligned, when something is unsustainable, when something is wrong, not within the person, but within the relationship between the person and the world around them. And if we're willing to listen, not just at the level of the individual, but at the level of the ecosystem, then distress becomes not just something to reduce, but something that can guide us towards better environments, better relationships, better systems, toward a world where fewer people have to reach the point of breaking just to be taken seriously. So I want to end with this. If you take one thing away from the ecosystemic model, let it be this. When you encounter distress in yourself or in others, pause before asking, what's going wrong here? And instead ask, what is happening here? What is shaping this experience? What would need to change for this distress to no longer be necessary? Because the answer is rarely found inside the person alone. It's found in the spaces in between. And those spaces are where change becomes possible.